Thank you. Now we come to the main part of the evening, the part you've all been waiting for. Our guest speaker tonight is Marek Reichman, Executive Vice President and Chief Creative Officer of Aston Martin Lagonda. He needs very little introduction to this audience, and his bio's in the programme anyway. But let me just say a few words. He's responsible for all current and future design development for AML and has been credited with creating some of the world's most iconic cars, including the Valkyrie, which of course you've all seen in the rotunda this evening. I suspect this audience will also be aware of his influence and success in other sectors such as boats, yachts, motorcycles, luxury residences and whiskey bottles. And for those who know my background, no surprise that one of my personal favourites is the Triton submarine. Marek has been a great supporter of the Trust for many years. He was a trustee between 2016 and 2023 and is now a member of the Trust's Advisory Council. Those of you with reasonable memories will recall Marek has been a speaker here before in 2008. So I'm really looking forward to hearing how his perspective has changed since then. We're also delighted to have Simon de Burton here to interview Marek. Many of you will know Simon and his work as a journalist and writer covering watches, classic cars and the luxury world. I'm really looking forward to the conversation between them. So without further ado, thank you Simon, thank you Marek, and welcome. If you come up. Great, thank you. I'll take my wine. I think do you need that?
We share the microphone.
It's on.
Ladies and gentlemen, can you hear everyone? Before we start, the more eagle-eyed of you would have noticed earlier when there was a picture of Walter Hayes that April the 12th is going to mark 100 years since he was born. So I think before we start, it'd be nice to raise another toast to that centenary. Richard, to your father's centenary of his birth. You must have been very proud of him. To Walter Hayes. Yeah, without Walter we wouldn't be here, of course, because he was the first chairman of the trust, but equally we wouldn't be here without him if he hadn't essentially saved Aston Martin by arranging a deal with Ford and being so instrumental in the creation of the DB7. In a sense, you could say he sort of future-proofed Aston Martin, made sure the marque was going to last beyond a very difficult period of time. And it's a different company to the one that he knew. And very much part of Marek's role is indeed sort of future-proofing Aston Martin for the next, well, 100 years, I suppose, or however far you want to look at it. What do you think Walter would have thought of today's Aston Martin, Marek?
Actually, I think Walter would have been proud of what we're doing. I've been with the business for 18 years, and I feel I'm part of the furniture in that respect out of 110 years. And when I first arrived, we had a dedicated platform, as Walter had intended, with DB7. That was a continuation of the 7. We skipped 8 and went straight to 9 because it was a philosophical change. But I think he would have been very proud and happy with the direction we took. I was a Fordie. I came through Ford. There's so much heritage and history in the marque, and what Sir Walter was doing was protecting that and giving it a future. And I think sometimes you have to be brave to give a business and a brand a future. And he pushed boundaries, and we've continued to push boundaries since that point.
When we were talking about what to call this evening, the subject, we decided to call it future-proofing the marque, because the word brand doesn't possibly sit terribly well with the typical Aston Martin owner. But it is a brand now, isn't it? It's a luxury brand. And what does that really mean, and when did it become a brand, and whose idea was it to turn it into one?
Yeah, I think if you look back, and I've put an image of heritage and history up on the screen, because a brand needs heritage to be truly a brand. You need a historical context to make something a brand, because you can draw on, to use a word Miles used earlier in our conversation, grittiness. You need texture to give something the status of brand, a marque. You need points in time that people can recognize. And brand becomes ubiquitous in many respects, but if you have true heritage, your brand stands for something. And we have 110 years of rich heritage, soon to be 111 years. And if you draw back on moments in time, what the brand, the marque, has done over that time, at some point you have to recognize that you have to tell a new audience about that. So you shift from being a sports car manufacturer to being a brand, a global brand that represents certain things, that there is a message, there's a feeling. Because over the years, you develop context. And then you want to tell people who are new to the brand, to the marque, well, why can you sell for such a price point? Why do you only make so many cars? What is about your brand that makes you special? So then you can draw on the heritage of what the brand has done to tell someone new about your brand who's never heard of it. And they'll fall in love with that story, with that lineage, with that texture that they'll have. And they become fans, and fans become customers, and those customers grow around the planet. But today, we still, in 110 years, have made approximately 110,000 cars. So it's not a brand that is looking to exceed volume, it's still about exclusivity. Therefore, you need a story to sell exclusivity as well.
A couple of years ago, when you launched the replicas of the DB5 Bond car, I was lucky enough to be able to drive one from Stoke Park back to work service. And one thing that made me slightly sad is that there were lots of sort of kids, I suppose, 10, 12, 13, and I'd expected them to look at the car and think, that's James Bond's car. But they didn't look at it at all, because it didn't really seem to mean anything to them. Do you think the Bond connection and 1959, the DBR1, the Mom double first and second, is that something that we're going to have to kind of put to one side as the generations develop?
No. Definitely not. You know, I think, you know, I have a 14-year-old son, and he is not fascinated with James Bond. He's not fascinated with DB5. He is now fascinated with Formula One, but he's also fascinated then to understand the layers that got us to Formula One or got us to winning the class at Le Mans. So most people who become fans of something want to know more about it. They want to look back at the history of why. And the DB moniker is important for us. So 5 is important. Whether you recognize it or you want to photograph it as a youngster is completely irrelevant. It is probably one of the most iconic cars that exists, partly because of the association with Bond, but it's also an incredibly beautiful car. It's an incredibly, it's a car that gives a statement. If you drive the car, if you get out of the car, whoever you are, all of a sudden you're cool. You can be anyone and step out of that car, and no one looks at you, they look at your car, and they look at the association of you and your car. And without a doubt, DB5 because of the mindset that has been given, because it's been seen in so many exciting movies with an exciting association, you could ignore all of that, but that subliminal message means it's a cool car. And cool is a word that is not often used for the car industry, but it makes you cool. It really makes you, as the owner, the driver, someone people look at and say, that's a great looking car, even if they don't know what it is. So I do think that it is important that we have the heritage. We continue with the heritage. You know, some images here of the cars that have won their class in Le Mans. And that is important. It's important because if you're making a sports car, you need to prove that your car is capable as a sports car. And you know, the base of that car is a road-going Vantage. And all of those things are important for those consumers, the new consumers that you're trying to attract to the brand, that want to know why. And they look through the heritage and the history and say, oh, you guys made the DB5, that's an amazing car. They may not have known when they see it on the street, but they may go and see Fernando in a Formula One car at the weekend and look at the history of what is Aston Martin.
I was going to ask you about Formula One. Have you noticed a sort of increase in interest from younger people since you've been involved in Formula One?
Most definitely. I mean, you have approximately 500 million eyeballs looking at the TV screen globally every other weekend during the season. And this year is 24 races. So even if the message is subliminal that there is a green car with an Aston Martin wing on it, more people know about the brand than previously. And F1 in particular is a much younger audience compared to people considering a DB5 as interesting. So Formula One brings a completely different set of customers. Just the following. Netflix has done an amazing thing for Formula One. Right now we have 3 races in America. Netflix has brought Formula One to life in the US. It's brought F1 to life here. More females are interested, more kids are interested in Formula One than previously because of that Netflix effect of, it's not just about racing for those 2 hours on a Sunday, it's all the things that are the backstory to that as well. You know, this character has really helped us as well because he's an amazing character. So you see an amazing character, amazing driver, and you want to be part of that team. So as someone who's a younger consumer of the brand, they want to know that they're part of a really cool brand, of a successful brand with a cool character driving. And that's what Fernando does for us with Formula One. So it's so important. The platform is there to really highlight what we do, which is make amazing road-going cars like the one in the rotunda downstairs. That is road-going Aston Martin. It's helped by the fact that on a Sunday, there's someone in green racing a green car with a wing on it. There's a subliminal association where people say, this is cool, that's cool, I want to be part of that story, I want to be part of that journey.
And in terms of sort of keeping Aston Martin relevant and taking it forward, do you feel a sort of massive sense of responsibility since everything is coming from you in terms of design and what's going to come next?
Yeah, there's a responsibility, absolutely. But I have a great team. There's one of them sitting over there, or 2 of them sitting over there actually, and team is really, really important. So yes, it's my responsibility, but you know, I've been doing this job for 18 years, and we have done so many breakthrough projects. And all the time as a designer, you're under your own personal pressure. I'm my worst critic. It's just me. I don't need any other critics because my head, my eyes, my hands are probably much more judgmental than all of yours. And I criticize myself. And I want to make sure that anything I do or my team does effectively is the best it possibly can be. So it's about pushing people to the limit. And I know I do that because, you know, sometimes I look at Miles, like this morning, he said, why didn't you tell me about that? A week ago, well, because I'm a little bit busy and I need you to do it. By when? By this afternoon. So the pressure is intense, and as a creative, you thrive on that intensity as well. So creatives are just as competitive as Cristiano Ronaldo. Every single creative has that competitive gene. They're just as competitive as Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll. We want to win, and our winning is making something so beautiful, but also working with our engineering colleagues to make it drive so well that the beauty attracts you, and then you're not disappointed by the driving experience. The gentleman that owns the Valkyrie, I think, has done 3,000 miles in the car already. And the thing is, it's impossible to use, okay? It's impossible to use.
All great designs are.
Well, but imagine 3,000 miles, and you stand on the seat to get in it. It's like getting into a bathtub. If I sit next to the driver, I have to get married to him because we're so close. But he wants to drive it and be seen in it, just like yourself in the DB5, because it's an incredible thing. Designers, creatives, are driven to that level of desire and success. We want someone to look at our products, the things we've created, and say, I love it. I don't know why, but I love it. And that's the passion that drives me. You can hopefully tell that I'm quite a passionate person. Despite the fact that I'm a Blades fan, a Sheffield United fan. Yeah, there you go. And I've suffered all my life because of that. But I'm still passionate about that team. And I'm passionate about the things I create and do. And that drives you to not fail. Because failure is incomprehensible in my mind. And I will do all the way to the last minute. I'll go in and, he's over there, bless him, Miles, and Leanne, who runs the interiors. And to the very last minute, I'll say, can I change it? No, it's too late. Oh, well, it's never too late. We can change it. And the team hates it. But you know what? They do it. They change it because we want to make it the best we possibly can.
I think one of your first radical projects was the 177, if not the first. At the time, that seemed like an incredible sort of fantasy car. Did you think at that stage that things could develop the way they have with things like Valkyrie and Valhalla and all the other things that you've done that have just seemed completely beyond?
177 was a seminal moment for sure. I mean, it was at the time we launched the car, it was probably the most expensive car on the planet. And by the way, we told the world about it during the financial crisis, where the people's cash went through the floor, and we said, oh, by the way, we have the most expensive Aston Martin ever. Despite that, all 77 units were sold. I think the company grew because of 177, because it learned that you didn't have to make a car and restore a car and sell it for over £1 million based on DB5 or DB4 GT, that you could do it with a new product, that the brand was strong enough to sell a brand new product. And we learnt so much internally. It was the first carbon fiber tub we'd ever done. It was a naturally aspirated V12 that was ground up and brand new. Philosophically, the car was important because we said, if anyone's ever seen a 177, a designer talks about A and B surfaces. An A surface is what you see, a B surface is the part that you see when you open a door, you open a hood, you open the trunk. That's a B surface. Part of the philosophical approach to 177 was there are no B surfaces. And every single element of the car had both beauty and function. The way that air was flowing through and under the hood, through the structure, so that we didn't have to have extra piping. We were feeding it through some of the structure of the car as well. The fact that the tub was in the mold, the surfaces you were never going to see were treated and surfaced in the same way that a fender would be. So the technology was incredible. The packaging was incredible. I mean, it's a true front mid-engine car, which still today, when you see it, is one of the most, and you know, I dare say it is one of the most beautiful in terms of proportion cars that you will ever see, because we do work on this philosophy of golden proportion. It fits perfectly within that. And it's dramatic, but it's not overt. It's classically dramatic, and that's an Aston Martin. It had the biggest face we'd ever done. We were almost panicking in the studio with it. Oh, this is a pretty big face, but we showed the car and people said, we love the face. And you push boundaries, and then the company learns. And because of that, you can push further and further and further. And we did Zagato projects that were even further reaching. And you know, it won at Villa d'Este the concept car, which is a public vote. So it's not voted by the judges there to judge the classic cars. It's given out to the public, and obviously you had an Italian public with an Aston Martin in Concord blue, and it won. And that for me was a very, very important step for Aston Martin. 177 was so important to then get us to Valkyrie eventually. And by the way, it was the same supplier in terms of the tub and chassis that we used for Valkyrie as well. So not just learning from product, but learning how to work with partners in supply as well.
I mean, back then, you were saying it was pretty much the most expensive car on the market, but the way things have changed over those 18 years, the sky really is the limit in terms of what people will pay for some of these exotic cars. Could you ever have imagined that happening 18 years ago when you started, that you'd be making cars 2-3 million in small numbers? And
there was a vision in my head that that's what the brand should be doing. Yes, I mean, I've flicked past it earlier. One of my first cars was obviously, you talked about Bond, was the DBS that went into Casino Royale. And I'd realized, look, when I came to the studio, and by the way, when I arrived, I think there were 4 people and myself, so a total of 5. We had a small plate. A plate is about twice the size of this platform where we design the cars. They're accurate. They're called plates because they're accurate to within 1,000th of a millimeter, and it's where you put the clay and you design on here. And we had one plate that was in the corner of a Land Rover design studio, so not even our own, because we were part of Ford. And when I came to the brand, the marque, I had all these amazing visions of what the design studio would be. And when I arrived, there was nothing. We had never, believe this or not, so that was 2005, early 2005. To that point, Aston Martin had never owned its own design studio in its history. So arriving, and I'd been in the US for about 10 years, starting to understand what brand and design and the power of say, Apple, as a for instance, was starting to have the amazing run that it's had to become a $1 trillion business. And that was all based on the fundamentals of design. And as a designer, you arrive at a company with an amazing brand. You say to someone, even back then, Aston Martin, oh, they make beautiful cars. They're amazing cars. And you get there and there is no design studio. So first job was create the design studio. And that was an important factor in creating the next generation of product. And even back then, I was thinking about how can we do specials, one-offs. Because I'd done my research, and a lot of Aston Martin's history and survival was based on the one-off cars that it did for certain customers around the world, typically in Brunei. And that's how the company was surviving. So one-offs were not necessarily public, but there was a mystery behind, oh, apparently they did and I always had in my mind, because most designers are egotistical, I wanted to do a one-off car at some point. I wanted to do limited edition cars. And by the way, you have to have an ego to be a designer, otherwise, what's the point? Because if you don't have an ego, no one's going to listen to you. If you don't think you're better than the rest of you, no one's going to listen. If I don't think I can design a better car than Miles, Miles isn't going to listen to me. And he's probably better than me, but I'd never admit it. But you have to have a vision. And ego is sometimes good, sometimes bad. But if you treat ego in terms of success, you can drive a business to follow what you believe is success. Sometimes ego destroys businesses. We won't go there, but it's all about your vision. And I saw straight away when I got there, no design studio, no true vision, probably since Sir Walter. So how do we get beyond the point that we're at, which was just 2 cars when I arrived, a DB9 and a Vantage.
And bringing Q in, was that your way of sort of introducing slowly the idea of bespoke, individual, going back to the original Aston Martin idea of everything being made for the customer?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've put up the Taraf on the screen, which was a Lagonda. So not only did we do Aston Martins through the time, we tried to bring back the Lagonda nameplate, which started out as a Q project, a special customer-based project for the Middle East, to reinvent the marque and produce a limited number of cars, which we have done through time. And I think I've flicked past a few others as well. Signet, as a for instance, was a point in time where we believed we needed to protect the brand from what's called the CAFE law, which is an overall emissions issue. And we were producing solely V12s, really. Mostly V12s and a few V8s. So that the point of, are we going to be taxed, or is the consumer going to be taxed based on our overall consumption? Therefore, we need a city car to negate that. It didn't turn out that way in the end, and Signet is a very, very limited number of cars that sell for around twice the price they were originally sold at. But it was a point in time that we needed. Taraf, exactly the same. You mentioned Q by Aston Martin, fundamental to our business to make one-offs, ultimately, or to make 100 off, or to make unique colors, to upsell the core, because everyone wants something unique. So really, really important to have Q by Aston Martin as part of the brand.
We were talking about heritage earlier on and tradition and all the rest of it. So how nervous were you about DBX, introducing DBX to a sort of a group of buyers who are basically thinking of Aston Martin as a maker of GT cars?
In my mind, again, and the team's mind, and I think the owners of the business and the CEO at the time, it was fundamental for the future. Because if you look at Porsche as a business, Porsche was making SUVs to be able to afford to do its icon, the 911. So Cayenne was providing the monetary funding to make sure you carry on with 911. And I think if you look at the consumer base, and I part-time lecture in China, in Tongji, in Shanghai, so I have a bunch of millennials, 19-year-olds that I teach. They believe an SUV is a car. They don't see it as separate to car. The next generation of consumer has grown up with SUV. It's not new, it's just part of the world. And I drive a DBX 707 right now, and I must say I find it really hard to go back to being in a DB12 or a DBS. I can fit 5 people, all the luggage, and if Darren Turner takes you on a hot lap in a 707, you can't believe what this car is capable of doing. It is literally a sports car riding higher. And so there was nervousness, yes, of course, because all of a sudden in this brand that has very seldom pushed away from its core, you're going to do something completely different, an absolutely different product. But we did so much research to define what the product should be. We probably had never tested so many competitor vehicles, analyzed proportion, analyzed the package of the car. We had driving bucks that we took to St. Athan before it became a factory. So in secret, we could drive the car around and look at it in different scenarios and situations. So we did so much research to make sure it was right, because yes, there's risk. There's an element of nervousness. But clearly the marketplace was right, because 72% of our owners had an SUV in their portfolio. Mostly Range Rover, but also other product that sat in their portfolio. So we knew the consumer was eager for this product. And the traditionalists probably would say, never. You know, just as Ferrari said they're never going to do an SUV, but we have Purosangue, which is not really an SUV, in the same way that DBX is not really an SUV. It just gets categorized there, because it truly is a remarkable sports car sitting a little bit higher than the other sports cars. And through the use of technology, you can make these cars that don't have the low center of gravity feel the same. And we had an amazing dynamics engineer who was responsible for a lot of the driving capabilities of the car, and one of the chief engineers, Andy Tockley, who put so much energy into making sure this car felt and drives like an Aston Martin. Visually, we also wanted, the first time you look at DBX, to see Aston Martin straight away. So it was all about, again, proportion, the amazing grille, the face, the fact that when you see it in the street parked in London, or wherever you may be, in a European city, out in Singapore, down in Sydney, that the car immediately looks like an Aston Martin. That you see it and you recognize the brand immediately when you see the car, which is so important.
Yes, so talking about that sort of diversifying from what everyone thinks of as Aston Martin, I want you to tell us a bit about some of the really unexpected things. For a start, the tower in Miami. I mean, how do you make an Aston Martin apartment?
So, Miami. The tower officially opens in May. We signed the contract 10 years ago, so 2014. So it's one of the largest skyscrapers in Florida, not just Miami. 67 stories. So right at the top is the helipad. That's me right at the top. No health and safety whatsoever. I had no harness. Literally, these bits of 2x4 were holding me from that drop from where the crane is down. We decided to do this because the development company, the Koto family, G&G, were amazing. They pestered myself for about 18 months. I kept saying, we don't build apartments, we're not interested. They kept phoning. They then talked to everyone in the business, an amazing family. And in the end, we signed the contract with them because they have been true to their word. It was a very, very strict contract in terms of the amount of effect we would have on the building from a design perspective and the materiality of the building. And why would we do it? Well, since then, Bentley, Porsche, Bugatti, Pagani, and someone else have built buildings. So I could say we were the first. And why? It opens you up to a new audience. It's a massive centerpiece in the US, and people know about it. You read about it in different magazines, different articles, and you can enhance your experience of what the Miami apartments look like and relate it to Aston Martin. So that's the lobby.
Yes, so tell us how you make it Aston Martin without kind of overdoing it.
materials are really important. Space is really important, you know, and I think that's such an important element, and having control of space and materials, but also being appropriate. I mean, you're in Miami, so marble works great because it's very cold to the touch. Therefore, you can reduce the amount of air conditioning you need. It looks exotic, but actually it suits the environment because you want to feel a little bit chilled when you go inside because you've got 80% humidity, and, you know, in terms of centigrade, 30 to 40 degrees through the winter months sometimes, and in the summer months you're touching over 40 degrees. So materiality was really important, but the sense of space and the sense of material and the sense of quality is what makes it an Aston Martin. And even down to the smell, we generated the smells, the touch, the feeling, the leather handles, the push areas, the lack of signage, the subtlety. And Aston Martin is very subtle. So this was all about not being overt. You're not shouting, you're not playing a trumpet in the lobby, you're just hinting at and giving the sense of an Aston Martin. And that's a really important factor of it. And we designed the interiors for consumers as well and customers. Plus, we internally designed the furniture that goes in there as well with an Italian furniture maker.
And a lot of the buyers of these places, are they Aston drivers?
The top 50 apartments, so all came with an Aston Martin as part of the contract. You have to buy it, obviously. So you have to buy the apartment and the purchase of the Aston. And just to give you a price point, I mean, unprecedented that 2 years before completion, they were 98% sold out. Normally you don't sell out until post-completion and people start to move in. And the one apartment that is the 2% of that is the triplex apartment at the top, which started off at 52 million, went to 55 million, and is now at 59 million, I believe, because each time they get a buyer, they put the price up because people want that apartment. And that apartment came with a Vulcan, actually. So you had one of the 24 Vulcans within the price point. And in the sales center, for many, many years, sat a Vulcan which belongs to that triplex apartment.
And each apartment has access to someone's car. I think an individual car can open access to the parking.
You basically, two things we did was design the ramps to the car park to perfectly work with the ramp angle of an Aston Martin. So if you drive a Ferrari in there, they'll scrape the belly. But if you drive an Aston up the ramp, it's perfect. And then as you get higher up in the car park, you have your individual spot, which is keyed to your apartment. So the higher you go, when you saw that mezzanine layer where the swimming pool is, all those apartments above are the Aston Martin suites, and they have their own separate elevator area when you go into the car parking zone. And those car parks are not, it's not a car parking space, it looks like an Aston showroom, yeah.
And what about some of the other things? So we've got the apartments, submarine?
Submarine, yeah. We were talking about the submarine earlier, so we worked with Triton on a submarine. A very interesting project. The most interesting factor with Triton was they were experts in their field. And subsequently, since our relationship, they were the company that created the submersible that went to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. So the engineer that we all worked with, John, developed the submarine. It went down to not our submarine, the one they developed at Triton, as one of the very few vessels that's gone to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. And it was an amazing titanium sphere, machined from solid billet titanium. Our submersible was not as deep-reaching. We could go down 1 kilometer, and the sphere that we used was made from acrylic. And I was letting everyone know on the table that acrylic has the same reflective value as water. So you're in a 200 millimeter sphere of acrylic where all the ancillary motors and running gear and air supply is behind you. So in front of you, imagine I'm sitting in a big acrylic bubble, and as you start to descend under the water, you just see the water rise, and as it's rising, what I'm looking at my knees looks like I'm in the water, and I'm sitting there in my shorts. You're not wearing equipment, you're pressurized in the bubble, and you just start to descend, and it's quite thrilling because the water goes above your head and you feel like you're in the water. And as you go down, so I'm telling you about the experience, not so much the Triton, as you go down into the ocean, when the pilot turns the light off, you can't see a thing until your eyes adjust a little bit and you can start to see the reflective light from certain fish. And then all of a sudden he turns the light on and there's a great white about 50 meters away and you just jump out of your skin. And it's that experience that the reason we did the project was so many of our ultra high net worth customers owned yachts, and the trend within the super yachts was shifting from the jet skis, if you like, and scuba diving to having a submersible on board because it's about the same size as a tender. So they, rather than putting tenders on their super yachts, they were putting submersibles on. So we had a link to the consumer and the customer there as well.
The sort of safety criteria are very stringent on those things, aren't
Yeah.
they? So how do you instill the feeling of Aston Martin into a submersible?
Well, we had started to develop the submersible from the very first concept. And again, as with any non-automotive project we go through, what I say to the partner is we have to have an amount of freedom to do what we want. It can't be constrained to the point where we're putting a wing over your object. We have to be involved. And a car has so many safety constraints and systems that you have to deploy, and each year they get more and more stringent, that it's exactly the same. You're looking at a different field, a different environment, but you have the same issues with safety and compliance and the need for crash regulations, etc. So you just apply what you do to a road car and put it into a submersible. The same with the helicopter as well. It's exactly the same. There's slightly different criteria. Some of it is less relaxed, some of it more relaxed than the car industry. You know, don't forget downstairs in the rotunda, that Valkyrie is an incredibly capable car to the point where it has what we call toilet seats underneath that have to dump aero because it's so aero efficient with ground effect at lower speeds. It's preventing the car's forward motion, so we have to dump the aero. Imagine that in a road-going car, which happens to have the smallest high-mounted stop lamp on the planet. It's 128 decibels in the cabin. It conforms to all European crash standards, and its road compliance is exactly the same as a Nissan Micra. You know, that it's exactly the same in terms of what it has to go through in side crash, roof crash, rear three-quarter crash as well. So as automotive designers, you become very clever at understanding the things that restrict you from being creative and finding an avenue around that, but still complying with safety. So actually, if you do a submersible or do a helicopter, you learn and you apply that back to the car and say, hold on a minute, when I worked with those guys, they did this. You know, photoreflective coverings over the bubble in the submersible. We looked at for screen technology in the car as well. How do you keep it clean, et cetera, et cetera. So many crossovers when you move into a different arena that apply to car industry.
I notice you're wearing the Girard-Perregaux Aston watch there.
Yeah.
Is that an important sort of collaboration because there's a lot of crossover between people that buy interesting cars, buy watches, buy boats and so on. Has that been an important way of finding new people?
Yeah, I think, you know, a watch is kind of synonymous with driver. And the industries cross over because we, particularly, as I mentioned, because it's 110,000 cars in 110 years with numerous limited editions, we become part of the world of collectible. So the watch industry has collectibles, the car industry, the world of art, wine, however you look at it, people want to collect. So one of the big things that people collect is a watch. And so having an association with a watch maker is really, really important. Girard-Perregaux is one of the oldest. The story of the barn that was generated was where Girard-Perregaux was developing its watches with other watch manufacturers. And when you look at the rich history of the brand, it really fit with our desire to have unique, exclusive, wonderful materials. So it is important. And again, it's learning. We're attracting consumers from a different segment. We're talking to a different consumer. But as a design business, we're also learning from that as well. You might argue that it's marketing also. We're learning from how do we market together? How do we talk to the consumer together? This particular watch, we made 307, which is the total amount of kilometers in one Silverstone Formula One race. It's made from parts of a Formula One car that are reconstituted, remolded, remachined, so there may be a little piece of Lance's car in here, who knows? We learned from that how do we develop something with a completely different industry and the material that we use, to the point where in future product like Valhalla will have recycled carbon fiber parts in Valhalla. And that came out of that relationship, and that's really, really important. It seems so minute, but that association with Formula One is massive, and that's what GP gives.
What's it like working on something as small as that, in terms of, because you have had some input into that, haven't you? And
yeah.
What's it like, sort of reducing your thought process to a watch compared with a Valkyrie?
The first time you work on a watch as a car designer, it's quite strange, because we live in the opposite paradigm, the opposite world. We sketch about this big, and we end up producing something which is 5 meters long. And in the watch world, they sketch about 1 meter wide and produce something which is 42 millimeters wide. So they work in the reverse. They work in a large scale and reduce it down. So actually, when you see a watch in CAD or in a large scale, it's a graphic language, then it's a 3D form. So again, you're applying the technology used to develop interior parts, to develop the graphic language of dial, whether that's future digital or an analog world. There's so many synergies that actually you apply yourself to. And I think the great thing about being a designer is you are a creative, and you apply your feeling and your way of thinking to any object you look at. It's a little bit like this room, I would love to do something in this room.
What would you change?
Oh, well, what would I keep, basically? So, but it's the language that when you look at something, you just see it and say, I want to do this. I want to change that, or I want to have this impression. And that is a really, really important insight into the brain of a designer. So when people ask, how can you do a watch when you design cars? It's not easy, but it's something you're already thinking about, because every time you touch, look, see something, you want to have an input. We're impossible people to live with. It's a disease that you have where you have to, you see something and say, I want to redesign that chair because I don't like the way it looks. I mean, I really don't like that chair. And I'm looking at the back of it saying, I would never do it like that. I don't like the material, the color, the little scoop at the top, and I can already see how I would design it.
The occupant's all right there.
This chair, the empty one. Yeah. So it becomes part of your mental thinking, how to improve. I mean, I hate airline seats. They're so poorly designed. We've never done an airline seat. We did lots of proposals for. But imagine we work in an industry where we have seat comfort engineers who are dedicated to developing a seat, whether that is a performance seat or a leisure seat, that you can sit in, and our race drivers in 24-hour races sit in a developed race seat for not literally 24 hours each, but for long stints, high-pressure driving, or you're driving across Europe in a DBX or a DB12, hours and hours and hours. The seats are pretty good for those long journeys, but after half an hour on a flight, my butt aches. So why don't we apply the same methodology of comfort into airlines? So again, it just hasn't happened yet. I'm sure it will one day.
We're going to ask if anybody has any questions for Marek. Marek, this gentleman, would you like a microphone, or have you got a loud voice?
Marek, I'm a very happy Rapide S owner. I was just wondering, what are the challenges of making a pretty family car that goes over 200 miles per hour?
That's a good question. The challenges. The challenge is convincing everyone else that you can do it. And that's the benefit of design, the benefit of a designer. So we can question, is it possible? A designer can draw and create a model that proves that it is possible. But then you need a very, very dedicated team that wants to come on the journey with you. The packaging of Rapide S for me is incredible. A lot of people may argue it's really tight in the rear, etc., etc. It's difficult to get into the back seats. But if, as a family car, and I've been in the back of a Rapide many times, I'm 193, 6'4", and I can fit in there. And my son, throughout his life, has always sat, when I had Rapide S's, in the back very comfortably. So the challenge is making sure that the team developing the car understands that you don't want to compromise beauty or 200 mile an hour capability to develop a product that looks the way it looks and has the usability that Rapide S has. And then it's about convincing. So you have to convince the team. You have to convince the management. You have to convince the board of directors that are investing the money in the car that it is a valid proposition. So you have to make models, you have to prove out. And it is, I still see Rapide S's and think it is a glorious, glorious car. And it has 4 doors and 4 seats and plenty space for luggage. So the challenge is drawing it and convincing someone it looks good.
There's a chap over here who's got a question for you.
Hello, Marek.
Hello.
My question is about the Lagonda in the AML, and how do you approach the designs differently, whether it's an Aston or the Lagonda, and if there is a plan for a Lagonda of some sort still.
Well, it's still part of AML, as you say. And we always looked at Lagonda in my tenure as a very different brand. There was one stage where there may have been some confusion around it being a nameplate over an Aston Martin, etc. But in my view, it was very much, when we did Taraf, an inspiration of Towns and what he had done. And that's important, and it stood for certain things. You know, Wilbur Gunn was an unusual character. The brand was very avant-garde. It's an older brand than Aston Martin. It stood for very different things. In its pre-war stage, there were wonderful cars that had 2 times Le Mans, a very different feeling and meaning compared to Aston Martin. And I'd describe Aston Martin by its essence as purer and more simple, and the Lagonda as more overt and more avant-garde. So there was always a desire to edge towards that, and using what Towns had done, which is quite a striking car. When you see one of those cars in the street, it's incredibly striking. So the whole idea in the reinvention, and if you remember, we did 2 concept cars that were all electric, called Lagondas. One of them just recently, I think, was awarded one of the most incredible concept cars of the last 10 years or something. It was all about a very different feeling to an Aston Martin, so more about private jet travel versus driving your own car. And the Lagonda was more about the uniqueness of the brand and what it stood for, its materials and its connectivity with those materials versus Aston Martin. Will we have a Lagonda in the future? Who knows?
Can I ask you a question about William Towns? On the basis I've just written a book about the Bulldog, which will be out in hardback in August at the Simon Pebble Beach, available to purchase. What do you think of him as a designer? I mean, the Lagonda was an extraordinary looking car, as was the Bulldog. The AMV8 was more inspired by an American car, but some of his other designs, like the Minimissima and the Microdot, and they were really ahead of their time, but kind of looked sort of homemade. And was he, you know, what do you think of him as a designer in terms of being realistic?
No, I think, you know, he was a breakthrough designer. So there were a lot of designers pushing for change, and I'd put him in the category of pushing for change. Whether he was at the right company to invest in that level of change is a different question. But for sure, and having had the connection with the family and being able to see some of his archives and some of his early sketches. And he used to live not too far away from Gaydon. They're quite incredible. And the ability to want to change was amazing. The ability in the sketches that you saw to try and produce something. And if you see a Towns Lagonda, it literally looks as though it's arrived from another planet. And the Bulldog the same. And you're seeing now how much desire and respect people are having for that genre, which at the time was quite, edgy is the right word, was quite forceful and almost brutal in its language. But that's almost de rigueur now. It's, brutality is almost accepted. And therefore it's coming back round to being a very, very interesting period where you look at it as a designer and say, actually, they were way ahead of their time. He was way ahead of his thinking, but it was a small group of designers that were thinking in the same way. As a, for instance, same designer, Lamborghini Mura, Lamborghini Countach. Curves, edges, because he was pushing the boundary, and that became an aesthetic that it was all about change. So it was all about how quickly can we change what we believe is old and not right. Imagine saying a Mura is not right. But that's what they were doing, challenging the aesthetic that existed. So I think he was one of the most important designers in that respect.
And there is a perception that the Lagonda was a failure, but in fact it helped keep Aston going, didn't it?
Oh, it did, yeah. So it provided a lot of Middle East sales that were so important to the brand. I'm sure if you talk to Wadders, he would explain much better the history of why Lagonda kept us alive. But it was an important market where the consumer was ready and accepting what we had, and it was different and really dramatic. When you see one of those Lagondas, they are super dramatic, super, super dramatic.
When you looked at the archive drawings, I don't know if you saw one of Towns's drawings he did when he was 8 of a bus, and his teacher had written this is a very nice bus, William, but you don't need this. And there was an arrow to some component. And he'd written next to it, why?
Yeah, typical design.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, enough of that. Any more questions? Here's one. Oh.
Ladies.
Thank you. Yeah, a bit of diversity of questions. So you talked about Formula One earlier. When do you think there will be a female Formula One driver, and why is it taking so long?
Very good question. Why has it taken so long? I think you have to look back at the world of karting, the way drivers get into Formula One and how they follow that pathway. And still today, with all the support necessary, there are still fewer girls coming into karting. And Miles is nodding because his son's a karter. And I can imagine the field is still 90% male. But there's no restriction, no preventative messaging about you shouldn't do it. And the only way to step up through into Formula One is to really gain your skill through the world of karting. You can come from other areas, but it really is, it's about early education. And we are still only, I would say, in the entire design department, 30% female versus 70% male. And it's not through lack of looking. There just isn't the mass of females coming in to get the majority at the other end to choose from. So when you find what I call right now a unicorn, who's an amazing female designer, they are relatively rare, because when I look at the portfolios, there'll be 90% male and 1 female. And it's the same going into the sport. So I think encouragement at those, you could call them grassroots levels, is the only way. So it's going to take 5 to 10 years to grow someone from that level. But there's no reason there shouldn't be. And I think, that the industry is trying to do more to support at that level to get females to come through. And just use the right language as well to say it's not a boys' sport. It's a sport anyone can do. And we have to encourage more people to go karting and be successful. And they can be. They absolutely can be.
So when do you think we'll see a female Formula One driver?
10 years. In terms of up there at the top, maybe in 5, some competitors, but up on the podium, 10 years is my view.
Questions. We all have seen that European legislation has been pushed from 2030 to 2040 on the death of combustion engine. We also see that green fuel is coming up. It's clearly foreseeable 10 years from now, green fuel will be down to 1.5, 1.8 euro the liter. Are you at AML taking this into account? Because when we listen very carefully to BMW, especially Volkswagen, the combustion engine is not dead. Definitely not. And I think as we talk, I just spoke to Martin, for him that he can't imagine a Bugatti Veyron on electric power. So there is something coming. Are you looking to this as well? And one last thing to women. I just raised with Sophia Flörsch at the Dubai Revival. She crashed with 220 straight into a concrete wall. And she's driving again. She's very fast. They're tough women. And we had Michelle Mouton. We had so many good women. It's just that last step into Formula One we have to do.
Yeah, and that's where we need the help, And Susie Wolf is going to do a lot in terms of making sure that happens and female drivers come through as early as possible. Going back to e-fuels, another great advantage of being part of the world of Formula One and having, our exec chairman owning a Formula One team, one of the major sponsors of that Formula One team is Aramco, and Aramco is developing fuels for the future. So we have access directly at the point of source to those e-fuels. And obviously Formula One switches to the e-fuel at some point. At 25, I think, is a switch into e-fuel. So we have access and understanding which will be to our benefit, so we can see the early signs of why. So absolutely, is it an answer? It's a different solution. Electrification will still exist, but e-fuels may coexist and be a different solution to the problem as well.
I think it's right. The revival this year is going to be completely e-fuel, isn't it?
Correct.
We've got time for one more. We just only got time for one more question.
The pubs are closing in 25 minutes. Just out of interest.
I'll let you.
How would you distinguish your design philosophy from your predecessors, and in particular your most recent predecessor?
Well, I've been doing it for 18 years, so it's not that recent. I think, you know, if I look at the breadth of portfolio that exists now within Aston Martin, it's a very different philosophy. But my job is not to create Marek Reichmans, it's to create Aston Martin. So as long as the predecessors were creating Aston Martins that kept the brand alive, then part of my role is to keep the brand alive now and into the future. And I see my vision and my ethos and design about relevancy, making sure that what we produce is relevant to whoever that may be in the future as a consumer, and not restrict who the consumer can be in the future. Obviously, we produce cars at an average sales price of probably plus £180,000. So you already are limiting who your consumer is in the world, but it's making sure that we stay relevant, that we continue to have front covers that say we're better than Ferrari. And I'd just like to repeat that we're much better than Ferrari, so you should look forward to your driver, the DB12. So my job is to keep us at number one, keep putting the drivers on the podium, and keep making cars that customers will desire, like the Valkyrie that's downstairs. And I think I would never discredit anyone before me. I have had an amazing opportunity with the brand in 18 years to go from 2 cars based off the same platform to a myriad of different solutions for Aston Martin, from SUVs to 4 doors to mid-engines, and we're about to launch our second mid-engine car with Valhalla at the end of this year. So I've had the best time of my life. So.
Marek, Simon, thank you very much. That was extremely interesting. I love the questions, and thank you for them. And I know you were burning with more, but I'm sorry we have to bring it to a halt at some stage. Thank you very much for your insight and your reflections. Before we let you leave the stage, we just have a little token of our appreciation for you. So thank you for that. Thank you.
If I could say, thanks to all of you as well for listening. I had so many more images on the slides, but I mean, Simon's questions were ample. But, the great thing is, when you're talking, it's great to hear the silence.